la División de Estudios Políticos y la División de Estudios Internacionales. Tenemos dos invitados de dos programas importantes en Estados Unidos, entonces lo que voy a hacer es voy a empezar a hablar en inglés, si no les importa, para que me entiendan lo que estoy diciendo. So once again, welcome all. We are here for this event organized by the Division of Political Studies and the Division of International Studies. I'm thrilled and very happy to have next to me two scholars that in the field of international political economy have been incredibly productive and that have, in many ways paved the way for new generations. Just to give you an idea, I was Bumba's student, Bumba's TA, Bumba's RA. He was on my doctoral committee, and then now we are co-authors. And because of my work as Bumba's RA, then I got familiar with David's work on many topics in international political economy. And so for me, it's kind of surreal to be here sitting next to them. And they are going to talk on two topics that are incredibly relevant in international relations and political sciences today. I think their productivity and the rigor which they conduct their research is not only exemplary, but also matches quite well, the objectives and the interests of our two divisions in international studies and political studies. They do political economy with a lot of rigor, and they, as I said, have been incredibly productive, publishing in the best journals in the United States. So thanks again, thanks Bumba, thanks David, and thanks Christina for helping us organize this incredible roundtable. And I'm just gonna give you a brief intro of our guests. David Burrs, sitting to the left of Bumba, is the head of the International Affairs Department in the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. Prior to joining the Bush School, David was a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, go Panthers, and at the University of Colorado Boulder, go Panthers, because I also went to the University of Pittsburgh for my master's in econ. David's research is in the field of international political economy, international organizations, and foreign policy. He has had a very prolific academic career, publishing more than 35 peer-reviewed articles in top journals in political science and international relations, including the Journal of Politics, International Organization, International Studies Quarterly, and Comparative Political Studies, among many others. Thank you, David, for accepting the invitation and for joining us today. Bumba Mukherjee is a professor of political science at the Pennsylvania State University. Previously, he was a professor at the Florida State University a long time ago, where we met back in 2003. And then we went together to the University of Notre Dame. And since, if I remember correctly, since 2008, he's been at Pennsylvania State University. He has also been a visiting fellow at Princeton University and at the Kellogg Institute of International Studies at Notre Dame, again. His current research interests study the political economy of populism, civil conflict, political violence, and development, as well as political methodology with an emphasis on machine learning and causal inference. His peer-reviewed publications have appeared in journals like the American Review of Political Science, Experimental Economics, Political Analysis, AJPS, CPAs, the Journal of Politics, and many other also top journals in poli-sci. But in addition to that, Bumba has authored 7 books. One time we used to joke about being a book publishing machine, and he accomplished that. And he's currently working on 2 other manuscripts that are already under contract, one with Cambridge University Press. So thank you, Bumba, for being here. And without that, I give you the floor for your presentation. ¿Podemos poner la presentación?
Sí.
All right. First, thank you so much for inviting me, and congratulations to CEDIC. 50 years. It's just a beautiful campus. I gave a talk here around 10 years back. CEDIC kindly invited me for that. So I'm very happy and thrilled to be back. In fact, and thanks to Christina and Sergio. I know you guys took a lot of trouble putting this together. So I appreciate the invitation. All right, so what is my talk all about? I'm going to talk about the rise of right-wing populist parties in developing countries. Okay. This is coming out of a book project. So the slides that you'll see are kind of a summary. So I'll walk you through this as much as possible. Okay, or as slowly as possible. Donald Trump just won the election. Let me just say up front, some of us are just a bit shocked. I'm at Pennsylvania, which is a very crucial swing state. It was really heated up the election. What do we know about Donald Trump? He's known as a right-wing populist. These are folks who will typically complain about immigration. Right-wing populists, it's a big issue in the U.S., not just in the U.S., in Europe as well. They'll definitely have xenophobic views, racist even sometimes. And they're very big on in-group solidarity. The majority group deserves economic benefits. The majority group, broadly defined, should not be excluded from material concessions, if you will. And Donald Trump is one example, obviously a very powerful example. He's the president of the world's largest economy. Others in Germany, in Germany, the right-wing populists are arguably slipping into the extreme far right, and we'll see what happens. And it's a problem in Europe for sure. Italy as well. Lots of examples. Plenty of examples. There's just three prominent ones. At least in academic social science, the work has largely been almost entirely on developed countries, which makes sense. Which makes a lot of sense. But the world is changing. We know that. I'm very sure in Mexico, all of you are pretty aware of it. The share of developing countries in global GDP has grown. So that's just, some kind of inflation-corrected GDP figures. Just gives you a sense. I'll just give a little bit of blurb. This is going a little away from what I'm really going to talk about today. In 1950, there was just one developing economy. That's China, basically. Autocratic among the 15 largest economies. Today, there's as many as 6. Mexico is one of them. India's another one. Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey. So countries like these, which weren't prominent economic players, at least in terms of their economic size, that world is changing. And again, barring China, these are all democracies. They have their issues, but they're democracies, established democracies at this stage. What's interesting is you see a lot of right-wing populists in the developing world. So 3 prominent ones, and I'm sure all of you know about Bolsonaro, right? And he lost the election recently. He may just come back as Trump did in the US. But there's Erdogan in Turkey. He's been in office since 2014. And there's Modi in India. This is his 3rd term. Okay, these are classic right-wing populists in the developing world. What we are trying to understand is, where do these right-wing populists come from? What gives rise to them in the developing world as opposed to the developed world? Okay, and why do they come into office sometimes, win elections, and other times lose office as well? Okay, so we're trying to answer these questions in our book. Why do we study right-wing populists? Well, this is nothing new. We know that they close down their economies. They tend to oppose globalization, at least in the face of it. They attack democracy. And they create other problems as well. I've written other papers where they also cause conflict, wars actually. So it's a problematic world that we live in, especially with right-wing populists. Okay. All right. So a little bit of data out here, just very, very briefly. I don't want to That's not the best looking slide, but what we did, that's me and Vinita, my co-author, and my graduate students are working on this. We collected data on what's happening with right-wing populists in the developing world. And what that figure on the left-hand side shows is they're increasingly getting more and more popular in the developing world, which is interesting, especially in Latin America, because in Latin America, it's always been the left-wing populists. Populism, the study of populism started with Latin America as an academic field. And it was always left-wing populist in the 1990s, 1980s. So this we're seeing is a dramatic shift. Since the last 20 years, so since the 21st century, it's the right-wing populists who are making a strong, I won't say comeback, they weren't around in the developing world, but they're becoming increasingly popular, just as they are in the developing world. So again, the big research question is, why do we see this? What's going on? And that's what we're trying to answer in our book, or we've tried to answer in our book. And so let me just give you a summary. We have a theoretical story that explains what has led to the rise of right-wing populists in the developing world. Broadly speaking, again, the developing world is complicated. It's very plain. But, we're, as social scientists, we're looking for some big theories out here, some generalizable claims, okay? So we have a story, very simple story. We argue in our book, that's me and Vinita, okay, my co-author on this project, that it's really driven by financial crises that happens in the developing world. Okay, that is an economic condition that leads to the rise of right-wing populism. I'll explain why. But also there's a supply side to it. And that is what's unique to the developing world, much more than the developed world, is political clientelism. Okay. Again, that's studied a lot in the context of Latin America, but not just in Latin America. Okay. All right, so let me explain what's the story here. So let me give a summary. So what does crises do? Financial crises, what does our theory tell us? And that's what I'll walk you through in the next 3 or 4 slides. Is it gives rise to business nationalism. You have these right-wing populists. So when you hear Trump saying in the US, make America great again, bring manufacturing back to the US, things like that, that happened in the developing world as well. Okay, it's not new, economic nationalism, business nationalism. Our big claim, I don't think that's a new insight by any means. Okay, what we find interesting is in the developing world, 2 groups find this very appealing. One is the traditionally dominant group, I'll explain what that is. And more interestingly, the socially marginalized group, which was traditionally the faction of the left. They're now gravitating, as we're seeing perhaps even in the US election, to the right. Okay, so that's the claim we make. But we argue clientelism matters. Clientelism creates that link between these right-wing populist parties and these groups. Okay? These traditionally dominant and socially marginalized. All right, so let me walk you through the next couple of slides. Okay, what is a financial crisis? I don't want this to be a lecture in economics, but typically in the developing world, you have currency crises. Mexico had a big currency crisis in '95, a long time back, but then many people were not born at that time. It was a big issue. People started studying financial crisis after what happened in Mexico. But another kind of financial crisis that happens, and I'll mention this very briefly, is where there's sudden capital outflows. Sudden capital outflows. We're seeing this in China today, of course, that's an autocracy, that's a different story. But developing countries have this problem as they globalize, expose themselves to global financial markets. They have very volatile capital flows. Capital comes in, they have some good years, and then it just goes on. But that's a crisis. That creates all sorts of economic problems, job losses, output contraction, which basically means economic growth slows down. And what you see on the right-hand slide out there, those bar graphs coming down, gives you a sense, and a list of developing countries that have had these financial crises, is how much growth falls, okay, because of this. It's pretty dramatic, right? So I'll just leave this at that. Okay. What's interesting? What is the politics here? So what does financial crisis do? It's job losses, okay? And this, in our worldview, what we argue in our book, is creates this window of opportunity for right-wing populists. Okay, for the Modis of the world, the Erdogan, the Bolsonaros, okay, in Brazil, to say, well, the established elite, you guys have some sense about how right-wing populists talk. The establishment has failed you, the elites, they don't have any policy to rescue the economy and things like that. And we are going to revive jobs through this program of business nationalism. I'll explain to you what business nationalism is. I'll get to that. That, we argue, is very appealing to the traditionally dominant group. Okay. Again, I'll get to what that is. For instance, in Brazil, as far as I know, my wife works more in Brazil than I do. That's Vanita. Okay. And she would argue that in Brazil, the dominant group are upper income whites. Okay. In India, they're upper caste Hindus. Okay. So these kind of groups, they're businessmen typically. Business nationalism, trade protectionism is very appealing. When right-wing populists make a noise about that, they find it appealing. Okay. Just as in the US, it's a little different, right? It's more about, I guess, broadly speaking, the white working class, however people would like to define that. But that's now expanded to other groups, other racial groups, what they're working class. Okay. I don't know whether that's a dominant group. We can argue about that. But another group finds this business or these appeals of business nationalism very exciting, and that's a marginalized group, the poor. Traditionally, as I mentioned earlier, the bastion of the left, no longer. The left takes them for guaranteed. That's a mistake. If the election in the US has taught us one thing, that's what we learn, but this applies to the developing. They tend to find these right-wing politics. What we argue in our book, and I'll show you some evidence for this, they find all these agendas very, very, very appealing. Okay, no longer class conflict kind of agenda. Okay, that's the argument that we make. All right, so what do these two groups do? Well, they support the right-wing populists, they endorse their economic agenda, business nationalism, promote domestic industry, trade protection, things like that. But that does not mean that they vote for these. They may find it appealing, they may put their thumbs up, go for their rallies and things like that. That does not mean that they'll vote for that. Voting is a complicated behavior, right? It's a complicated act. And that's where the supply side of our theory comes in. We argue clientelism matters. Again, this is not new, right? In the developing world, especially scholars of Latin America have written a lot about clientelist networks, how political parties make connections, especially with poor voters, using their clientelistic connections. I can talk about what clientelism means. I'm sure many of you guys have read about this in your classes. Okay, we argue this right-wing populists exploit these clientelist networks as much as left-wing populists or left-wing parties or even centrist parties in the development. But in the context of this financial crisis, this clientelism helps them get over the bar. So the business nationalism makes them popular, but clientelism ensures that these traditional dominant groups and the marginalized groups vote for it. And that, we argue, that's a big prediction, which you guys can see there, the hypothesis, leads to the rise in the electoral vote share. Okay, more votes for right-wing populist parties. Okay? So that's a big claim, a central prediction. All right. So we test this. Now I'll talk about this very briefly. Okay, so we have some causal claims. And if you've been introduced to American social science, causal inference is all the rage. We want to test causal claims through running experiments. We also want to do all these large N or these bigger, broader tests. So I'm going to show you, we've done a whole bunch of it in our book, obviously. I don't have the time to present that here. I'll look at one claim. One of our claims was, what I was describing in our theory, is that business nationalism gets these traditionally dominant group people and socially marginalized groups to endorse the right-wing populist agenda. Okay, I'm going to show you some results of this from Brazil and India. Okay, two cases, if you will. And then I'll do that large N test, if you will. We look at developing countries, developing democracies, where we test our main prediction. So that is empirical strategy, broadly speaking. So let's walk through this very briefly. So we ran survey experiments, two very big countries, both Brazil and India. In the case of India, there are obviously similarities, differences. Let's not hide the differences. But this is just a survey experiment. Geographically stratified samples and things like that. I can talk about this boring social science stuff if you want later. But In the case of Brazil, Bolsonaro was there in office, lost after COVID and the recent elections. Of course, but Brazilians remember what happened with Bolsonaro, and so it's apt to run a sort of experiment there. In India, Modi's in office, right-wing populist. They experience it. He didn't do very well. He's still in office. His party lost a lot of votes in the recent election. India has actually had elections at the same time, largely as Mexico. It was during the summer, actually. It was interesting to watch both countries at the same time, at least for me. All right, so in the survey experiment, we test what is it about this business nationalism? Does this drive these traditionally dominant groups, citizens in general, to support right-wing populists, to endorse that? Yeah, these guys are saying the right thing. Like in the US, Donald Trump is saying the right thing. The Democrats don't know what they're talking about, right? So we want to test that, but in this case with Brazil and India. So we run this survey experiment. It's very standard kind of survey Vinet-based experiments. And I can talk about that later in detail. And we see whether respondents, basically we're trying to trigger whether through this treatment, whether business nationalism gets them excited about right-wing politics. That's what we're trying to do, okay? In Brazil and India, more specifically. All right. So, we have these dominant marginalized groups. I talked about this during my theory slides. In India, the dominant groups are the Hindu upper caste. In Brazil, it's the upper income white. In India, the marginalized groups are lower caste groups, backward groups, if you will. That's what OBC stands for. In Brazil, I believe, again, I know relatively less about Brazil relative to Benito's, whatever I've learned from our here. Is those with African origin, indigenous citizens, tribal groups in Brazil. They're the marginalized groups. Okay? They've been left out of economic opportunity and political opportunity in them. So that's what we do. We test this using our survey data, survey experiment data. Just some figures here. So there's slight differences. I mean, between India and Brazil, not that much. There's just generally support. In India, it's insignificant. It's a little weak, actually, which surprised us. Brazil, it's really stronger, but this is just a full sample. This is just including everybody in this. When you start looking at specific groups, then it gets more interesting. Okay? Both in India and Brazil, not surprisingly, at least from our perspective, both the dominant groups are very enthusiastic about right-wing politics. And that's not surprising. Again, that's their economic interest, right? They like trade protectionism, they like business nationalism. So they're responsive. And you see that in the survey experiments very clearly. Okay. This to us is interesting. Frankly, we went into this experiment thinking that there's no way marginalized groups will vote for right-wing people in general and right-wing populists in that. These are groups who've both in India and Brazil, as much as in the US, for instance, have always voted for the left. They're loyal foot soldiers of the left. That's changing. That's really changing. And I think this requires a lot more work, a lot more research. I could be wrong. Again, these are just two countries, one point of time. So this is crying out for much more research. But what we are seeing in these figures is these marginalized groups, okay, with traditionally bastions of the left, are finding these appeals by right-wing populists very appealing. They think it's cool. The right wing are the cool guys, the left wing are old, they're boring, kind of. Okay. So that we see some evidence. They like business nationalism, everybody likes it, which has implications which I'll get to. All right, this is the more boring stuff, if you will. This is the large end test. So we're looking at a whole bunch of democracies, developing countries, 58 in all. Our claim is, you have this financial crisis and clientelism. These two factors, when you combine them together, that's when you're going to see these right-wing populists do really well in elections. That's our claim. So we test that. We run a lot of statistics, a lot of models out here, basic, pretty simple stuff in the end. We get some interesting results, pretty strong results, stronger than we anticipated again. What these figures are basically showing you is the more clientelistic these democracies are, the stronger those networks are, and they suffer from a financial crisis, that's when support for right-wing populists go. Right, that's what all these statistical figures are showing you. But what's interesting to us is in the end, what this means is these right-wing populists, and this is underestimated a lot in politics in the developing world. They're as adept as centrist parties and the left in exploiting clientelist networks. Okay. Let's conclude. You guys have been very patient, but to conclude. Okay. So what does this mean? The rise of right-wing populism in the developing world a lot. It's scary, frankly, for lots of reasons, but there's this economic implications. It's not just the developed world that is closing their doors to a global economy. It's also the developing world. We can talk about that. That's a stepping back. And I think Mexico is facing those challenges as well, quite significantly. We are also going to see the rise of business nationalism in the developing world. That's another economic outcome, if you will. At least these are social science predictions. They could always be wrong. But again, to me, what's interesting is something I've been harping on through the presentation is this link between clientelism and right. Never studied, never examined, but we know it's there. We have some sense, and we're hoping you guys can pick up. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Mumba. Very interesting presentation. We're not gonna go into David's presentation, if you guys don't mind, and then we do a full round of Q&A after David's presentation. So David, let's just change the presentation. We can grab this.
My next. What do I? How do I press this?
So this is the right. It's going down. I think I'm gonna get out of this.
Yeah. We have to get out. Yeah.
Let's get out of that.
Changing the presentation.
Yeah.
Mumba. The microphone. Yeah.
So you went from I think I didn't remember the Florida State, but only a Florida State mandate. Only the Florida State. But quickly. 3 years. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you very much, Christina, for the invitation. Christina and I overlap. University of Colorado, but also from the University of Pittsburgh, where she was an undergraduate. So very honored to be part of this. I'm going to sit down when I present, unlike my colleague. The crutches are mine. I have now a titanium right knee, which was done to set up the left ankle replacement, which will be in 10 days. So I am an old man. Fortunately, I have kept my hair, which makes me perhaps look a little bit younger. So with this is going to be a talk on immigration. I have fewer photos in my slides consistent with my age. Mostly they will just be words. And if I start to speak too quickly, which is one of my tendencies, raise your hand and I will try to slow down. Okay. The research question that Andrew Hart and I are trying to tackle in this paper is we're going to explore the relationship among three different policies. The first two, immigration openness and what we call immigrant inclusion, are the two different dimensions of what I'm going to call migration policy. Immigration openness being the external dimension, how many immigrants does policy allow to enter legally? And immigration inclusion has to do with how they are treated when they arrive. And we also then want to consider, as the third, a certain dimension of fiscal policy, what I'm going to call compensation spending. And you'll see in a moment, we're going to focus very specifically on cash compensation spending. Now, to be clear, all three of these policies have been studied individually. We have lots of papers that has, for example, immigration openness as the dependent variable. We have lots of papers with compensation spending or the size of the social safety net as the dependent variables. We have some, but somewhat less with immigration inclusion. And we also have some limited amount of studies that consider certain combinations. For example, in the migration policy literature, and some of you, I think, work on this, there was what was called the numbers versus rights debate. It said that do immigration openness and immigrant inclusion have a positive or negative correlation with each other? But that debate did not really consider the third dimension of compensation spending. And similarly, there's been a big debate in the compensation literature, this proposition, and I don't like the term, but I'm going to use the term, welfare chauvinism, which links immigration openness with compensation spending. And that argument has been when there are a lot of immigrants present, then citizens want less compensation spending. But there has been very little literature which considers all three as a package. Now, I will point out one paper that does do this because we've made an effort to build our paper from them. But the International Organization Special Issue in 2021 had a paper by Sarah Goodman and Tom Popinski that I think takes a first stab at putting these three policies together. And we're going to try to do a little more here. But the central question we're asking is, do these policies, these three policies, fit together as what we might call an embedded liberal triad, to use John Gerard Ruggies' term? Or, in other words, do these things have to go together? Or are there political constraints that make it very difficult for them to go together? And that's what we're going to call the possible political trilemma. So what we're going to consider, and this is where I'll start to talk about some theory, is we're going to theorize from existing evidence about citizen preferences. There's lots of surveys that have been done. I've done some of these in my own work to form hypotheses about state policy formation in these three issue areas. And so we're going to focus in this argument about the incentives and the disincentives for policymakers within the democratic political system. So our theoretical domain is the democratic potential destination countries. The United States is one, Mexico is another. And similarly, we're going to focus primarily on the post-Cold War era where you have these new sort of immigration pressures that these potential destination countries are facing. Okay. So what you see in this sort of table, so to speak, the columns for the three policies: openness, inclusion, and then cash compensation. And then the first row I want to talk through are why democratic policymakers might want to adopt all three. And these are arguments, I think, that many of us are familiar with. But democratic policymakers certainly have incentives to consider immigration openness. The defining feature of most of the advanced industrial democracies is what I'm going to call, and others have called, a low-skilled labor shortage. And they can let this low-skilled labor shortage go unfilled, but there are electoral costs to democratic policymakers. If nobody fills these jobs, there's likely to be a negative growth shock, which is not good for re-election. If we try to fill these low-skilled labor positions by paying more for domestic labor, there's likely to be an inflation shock. I think that's what we're about to discover in the United States, but I'll put that aside. Okay. So there are clearly incentives for democratic policymakers, and privately, many of these people, including Trump, actually made a statement that he's going to get rid of all the illegal immigrants, but then find ways to bring in new legal ones. So I think even the political right understands this incentive. Certainly, there are incentives for immigration inclusion, and there are a couple of them. One is that democracies are founded on a set of individual rights, albeit these are focused on citizens, but a lot of pressure on democratic governments to treat the people within their political economy well. And as I'll talk about later, if you want to attract high-skilled immigrants, you're going to probably have to have fairly inclusive policies because they could go elsewhere. So there are also incentives to have more immigrant rights, more inclusive policies. And lastly, cash compensation. The whole argument that John Gerard Ruggie made about the importance of a social safety net compensation is this provides domestic political stability in the face of economic shocks. And this is why I focus on cash compensation. There's a lot of evidence from economics that recipients of these compensation programs prefer cash compensation. This is more effective potentially at stabilizing than, let's say, in-kind benefits. So we're going to focus on that. Now let's talk about the disincentives, which for political scientists are probably also fairly obvious. Citizens, voters, in every survey that I have ever looked at, voice strong opposition to more immigration. Okay, they don't want more foreigners in their country. Similarly, if you were to ask a question in surveys about how much rights immigrants should have, voters will often will state preferences that say, we prefer not to give foreigners more rights. There's less opposition on this dimension, but still voters are not in favor of this. Now, you might think for a moment that, well, citizens may not like immigration and immigrant rights, but they like cash compensation. But it turns out that's not that simple either. Citizens do have preferences against, in many cases, cash compensation, because this means that they might be potentially paying higher taxes. And they are especially opposed to this when they believe that these cash compensation benefits could be going especially to low-income foreigners. This is the welfare chauvinism proposition. Okay. So if we sort of start with this logic, and then let's consider the possibility of an embedded liberal triad. And this is basically an extension of John Gerard Ruggie's argument. He really focused on trade, but I'll just apply this to migration policy. Given voter opposition to both greater openness and more immigrant rights and inclusion, democracies will not be able to move in this direction of a more liberal migration policy without providing more generous cash compensation. And there is a fair amount of evidence that embedded liberalism is being sort of used for trade policy. Plenty of evidence that says OECD governments have a larger social safety net when they have more trade open policies. And there's some evidence to suggest that citizens have more positive trade attitudes in settings where they are receiving more compensation. So one could make an argument that embedded liberalism supports open trade policies. But I'm not sure, and this is the transition point, I'm not sure the same is true for migration policy attitudes. I did a paper with a former graduate student where we looked essentially to see if the same measures of compensation in a survey across advanced industrial democracies produced more positive attitudes about immigration. And the answer was categorically, it does not. We can't find any evidence for that. So given that, we're going to propose a potential embedded liberal migration policy trilemma. Now, let me explain what I mean by trilemma and why I'm going to call it a political trilemma. This is not an economic sort of clear trade-off in the sense of, if you know, monetary policy and the impossible trinity. This is not like that. This is really based on attitudes about citizens, or attitudes of citizens. And if those attitudes were to change, this trilemma could disappear. So it is based on citizen attitudes as I think they are now. And what we're arguing here, or this argument, is that given all these citizen preferences, these opposition to these policies, a democratic state, even if it wanted to, will not be able to move towards all three policies together. This is sort of the trilemma logic. Now, they can certainly have less than, so what we're saying is it'd be hard to have all three. Maybe they can have two. They could also choose less than two or none. That's consistent with the trilemma, but it will be hard to have three. So to sort of talk through the logic here, let's sort of start on, okay, you've got a triangle. We've got each of the policies at the angles of the triangle. So let's start on the left side. And here we're using terminology that mimics the Goodman and Popinski article. If governments are starting with generous immigrant inclusion policies, a lot of rights for admitted immigrants, and they also have existing generous cash compensation policies, then can they also add more immigrants? And the argument we're making is this is going to be very difficult. And it's going to be very difficult because more immigrants will enter with rights, which will allow them potentially to access the cash compensation. And per the logic of welfare socialism, citizens are going to get really upset about this. So the democratic state will have trouble adding openness if they're starting with inclusion and compensation. We go over to the next side where they're starting with inclusion. They have a lot of, and they also have immigration open. So what we would call a very neoliberal, in this sense, migration policy. Can they also try to embed that liberal migration policy into the social safety net with more cash compensation? And the argument here is similarly, it will be very difficult because we're bringing in so many immigrants, because they have rights. If they had rights, they could access the compensation if it existed. So we prefer not to give it, not just to immigrants, but not even to our own citizens. Compensation will stay low. So this is kind of the neoliberal model, so to speak. And then the same logic would suggest from the bottom, if you've got generous compensation and you are letting immigrants in, voters are going to punish you if you give them rights because they're going to have access to these compensation programs and citizens don't like paying higher taxes. So that's the trilemma article. Now, this is a complicated slide. Indulge me, I'm not going to talk through every cell here. But what we're going to do to test this is estimate a sequence of country year models where one of these policy variables will be the dependent variable, regressed on the other two and their interaction. And so what you see there are the three models that we're going to estimate. And then in this table, we have a set of predictions for each of the primary coefficients that come from either the triad argument or the trilemma. Now, to be quicker, what I care about most here, and we'll point out when we get to the empirical results, is the last column in this table. The primary prediction that these two arguments are making concern the sign of the interaction. Per the logic of the triad, if you have more of two of these policies, you can get the third. You have to get the third in many ways. But per the logic of trilemma, it will be harder to get the third, the policy that is the dependent variable, when you have already more of the other two. So my empirical analysis is going to focus, just for brevity's sake, on the sign of the interaction. Now, so I'm also going to go through a sequence of models, which I'll explain very quickly here. We're going to lag all independent variables 1 year. This is not about causal identification. This does not provide that. What I'm trying to do here is not estimate the same contemporaneous correlation in all three models. So we could get different results from one in different models. We're going to control for potentially confounding factors with country fixed effects, a lag dependent variable, and a set of substantive controls, and substantive controls are listed there. You won't see them in the regression tables. And we're going to assess the potential for still unobserved confounders affecting our results using Emily Oster's delta statistic, and I'll talk more about that if you want. Otherwise, we'll just skip it. But here is basically our country year sample. And we have around 740 country year observations. These are the OECD countries, beginning in 1995. Effectively, we have this data through 2022 for the migration policy, but the OECD has not yet updated its compensation measures. So the regressions will be a little shorter than that. All right. Now, I'm going to move quickly through the data, but the data that we're using are the data that Andrew Hart and I have collected and used in other papers. So we are going to code a measure of openness, immigration openness, a measure of immigrant inclusion using two OECD series that cover all these countries. And these OECD series capture all legislative that were voted on, but also administrative changes on the executive side. So we're coding policy, and we're coding it using an equal weighting scheme, a policy that makes either openness or inclusion more liberal, we're going to give it a +1. And if it makes it more restrictive, a -1. Now we're going to start all countries at 0 when they enter our sample. Now, just very quickly, I know that all countries did not begin with identical openness and inclusion measures. But as I've already told you, we're going to have fixed effects in the model. So if I gave everybody a different starting point, this would change the country fixed effects, the country dummies, but it's not actually going to change any of the coefficients of interest. Okay, so here is what our measure of immigration openness looks like. And this is capturing policy related to quotas, labor market tests, transaction costs for entering, and other external policies. And what you can see, and this is consistent with other data sets, is that the advanced industrial democracies are slowly, in the post-Cold War era, slowly opening policies. They are bringing in more immigrants, or at least have more open, slightly open policies. Now, some are also moving in a negative direction. So what you see here is the average value, the maximum, and the min. And so some countries are moving towards more restrictive policies, but on average, OECD countries have more open policies post-1995. If we go to the inclusion measure, what we're doing here is aggregating policy in the same way based on legal protections, rights, social civic integration, family residency, naturalization, and citizenship. You see a somewhat similar trend. That is, the OECD countries are becoming slightly more inclusive, but not as much as they are open. So inclusion, positive trend there, but a less steep positive trend than openness. And in this last slide here, this is the OECD data on compensation. We're measuring cash benefits per capita in thousands of constant US dollars. And so that's fairly static. I mean, we have a couple countries that barely have any cash compensation, some that have more. Now, what I will say, and I'm just going to move quickly, notice a very slight upward trend here. Whoops, sorry. Very slight, even more upward trend, and the biggest upward trend is here. So you have some superficial descriptive evidence that might be consistent with the embedded liberal triad. On average, the advanced industrial democracies are moving in a more embedded liberal direction in all three policies. But if what you do here is, okay, what I've done here is I plotted every OECD country for which we have a full-time series in that trilemma diagram based on whether they have an above average measure in 29 for that policy dimension. And what you can begin to see here is, okay, let's take the country in the middle. Interestingly, the United Kingdom. It is below average in all three. And that makes sense. They are traditionally a neoliberal country, a thin social safety net. And their Brexit had to do with immigrant restrictions. So they are below average on all three. They have 0 of 3. If they are in the corner, so in the corner here, I mean inclusion, that's Denmark, Mexico, and Sweden. They're above average on that dimension, but below average on the other two. And on the corner in compensation, we have a lot of countries that they have above average compensation, but below average inclusion and openness. A couple that are below average in openness, but below average in inclusion. And then what we have on the sides are the countries that have 2, but not the 3. And then at the top, you do see 6 countries in our sample that are above average on all 3. So some evidence, but that it is possible to have all 3, but that corresponds to only 20 of 26 countries. Okay, so this is just descriptive evidence. So let's have a look at some more deeper patterns here. So what we're doing here is, and I'll kind of skip the models. We're starting with a model with no controls because this is relevant to the Oster delta statistic, but who cares? We start to add the confounders in the second column, add more confounders in the third. So we're going to focus on the third column here, where we're going to claim that we have controlled for confounding factors. And so what's the coefficient look like? Well, what we're most interested in here is the coefficient on the interaction term, which consistent with the trilemma logic is negative. And you can see some marginal effect plots here that aren't quite showing up well, but the trilemma logic will produce a negative slope. So there is a significant positive relationship between inclusion and openness, but only when you have very low compensation. And as compensation goes, that positive relationship disappears. And similarly, you can have a positive relationship between cash compensation and openness, but that relationship washes out as inclusion grows. Now, here we, new dependent variable, here we put cash compensation as the DV. And again, I'll skip this, but what we care about most here is the sign on the interaction term, which is again negative. And the Oster delta statistic suggests that we don't have confounding programs here. And what do we see? We see again the same negative slopes in the marginal effects plot. That is, inclusion and cash compensation are positively related with each other, but not when there is a lot of openness. And similarly, openness and compensation are significantly associated with each other, but not when there's a lot of inclusion. Okay, so if you're buying so far, we get trilemma results, then it gets interesting. Now, when we shift to the inclusion models, notice the sign on the interaction term. Here we start to find some evidence that looks consistent with the embedded liberal triad. Okay, now this will be my final slide. Well, we'll skip these. You see the positive slope here, which comes from that last model. So the question you might have, and you should, if you don't have it, you still should, is do we have a set of inconsistent results? And I'm going to try in my last slide to suggest to you that they might not be so. So we're going to argue from two stylized facts that this evidence that we find may not be inconsistent with each other. And the two stylized facts are this. We're going to argue that there are effectively two international labor markets. There is a low skill labor market where there is much more supply. There are a lot more migrants than there is demand for migrants. There is also a high skill labor market where there is high demand, but relatively low supply. We're also going to argue in the second stylized fact that democratic policymakers face lobbying pressure from two different sets of firms. One set, let's say here, maybe the agricultural industry in the United States, lobbies for openness because they need to get a large number of what might be called low-skilled workers. They don't care much about rights. They just need a lot of workers, and they can get them with more open policies. But you have another set here, and let's call this Silicon Valley. They need more programmers, but they don't need to lobby for openness because they don't need a lot more workers. They just need a few. What they are lobbying for is inclusion, because the programmers will go to Europe if they can't get more rights and privileges in the United States. So the democratic state, given these labor markets and these different lobbying pressures, they find it hard to respond positively to the lobbying pressure for openness, because if they already have inclusive policies and generous compensation, a much more open policy is going to be consistent with the trilemma logic. They're going to have to give rights to these immigrants. Compensation programs are going to cost a lot. So they're going to resist that lobbying pressure. But conversely, it's a lot easier if you are starting with openness and you are starting with compensation to accede to the lobbying demands for inclusion. Why? Because you can already admit these high-skilled workers under your already existing quota. And if these workers enter working with high incomes, they can help pay for the social safety net. So it becomes a lot easier to accede to that lobbying pressure. So what you may get, and I think this is what we are seeing in this slide at the top, in that top box, embedded exclusionary openness, are a set of countries that have all three, but they are targeting these policies towards getting more high-skilled immigrants. And there's some superficial evidence that that's what they're doing. Now, the question is this a sustainable policy? And if more countries start to follow embedded inclusionary openness, but there are not more high-skilled migrants to bring in, then these efforts may not produce more high-skilled immigration, in which case you've got a vulnerable policy because you could bring more low-skilled workers in under the quota that would be expensive. So I don't know how long these countries can stay in that triad setup, but some clearly are. That's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Let's open the floor for questions. What if we collect a couple of questions, okay? And then our guests answer to them. And then we collect another set of questions, and we do this repeatedly until we all have the opportunity to ask questions if we have any. Okay, Cristina?
So I have a question from that and a suggestion for David. More for me after. So there's something in the results you presented that doesn't convince me, and I'm curious if you looked into it. And next, is there a possibility that the story is not necessarily consistent between the two countries that we look at? When I look at Brazil, the result for centrists dropped, and at the same for the socially marginalized groups. And at the same time, we see it rise very highly for nationalism. So to me, that's a slightly different story than what we see in India, because we see an increase for the centrists as well as for nationalists. To me, the story for Brazil might also be told something like, there's a desperate desire for change in face of crisis, and there's no matter what direction that change goes in. So we go from left to right to left again, back and forth with ping pong ball, as opposed to switching for a right-wing populist. And in India, it seems maybe that the policies themselves are driving things, and hence we see more towards the centrist and also more towards nationalist.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's something you've looked into, and I'm curious your thoughts on it. And then for David, the suggestion is that if the story you're telling is accurate, then it might be a little bit stronger in economies where we see things driven by a few industries. So when you have GDP based on one or two industries in particular, I think it's in Norway and Adrian's work, then you would see a more diversified GDP. And so if you look at putting some sort of control variable in the analysis that will allow for you to examine that, then maybe you could see if the story behind your things.
Can you think of the name of that variable?
You'd have to make it.
Okay.
But in terms of being able to divide that,
Okay.
if you have a single industry that's lobbying much heavier, then they're going to also be able to argue more for those high skilled workers.
Yeah.
Christina, that's a great question and a very sharp observation. So we've got that question from reviewers. So I'm amazed that you just saw a slide and you could pick up on that. So that's insightful. So the short answer to your question, and there's a long answer as well, but the short answer is, in the case of India, you see this, you're correct, you're absolutely right. You see that the centers, stronger results for centers. Because as far as I know, again, I know relatively less, and I wish Vanita was in this room, she's not, to Brazil. But in India, the centrists, for want of a better word out here, they're more comedians, if you will. So they're very quick to pick up what the right-wing populists say. So I think what we're seeing in the survey experiment in India, again, I think we did not do enough manipulation checks, background checks, and our reviewers got up on that. They did catch us on that. They definitely adopt, the tone, the language in actual elections. So what has happened is the respondents saw the vignette which I didn't talk about, about business nationalism, and I'm not surprised. So those thought, a lot of them probably likely thought, oh, this is what that mainstream party says as well. And that's why you're seeing that strong side. I think we did not design our experiment that way, especially for India. We weren't very careful. In Brazil, as far as I know, and again, this is lack of knowledge, so I could be completely wrong. Is I believe the divide, unlike India, between not just the right and the left, that's always there, and right-wing populism, left-wing and left-wing populist, but also between the right-wing populist and the centrist is far more clear in this way. And so, as far as I can tell, based on that, I could be wrong about that diagram. So what we're seeing in terms of the survey experiment in Brazil is not in a way. We're seeing much weaker. But there is a problem. It's not sitting very nicely with that claim. I think those are the advantages of doing experiments. It's easy to say, hey, we're not getting anything. But yeah, sorry. Best answer to your question.
David?
Well, thank you. I guess at the moment, I hope that the economic diversification is probably a fairly fixed property of the country. And so maybe at the moment, the country fixed effects are absorbing that. But except they're not, sure, I will. I got to think about how to do that.
David, you?
Yeah, thanks so much for coming, both of you. Come back and giving these terrific presentations. Thanks so much. For Moba, I'm very intrigued and convinced that business nationalism is driving a lot of this. But we talk or we will talk more about what business nationalism looks like. In particular, I'm not sure that it's right wing. I mean, it's all a lot of it is about protectionism, right?
Yes.
So is it left wing? And this is so you're saying that the poor are now voting for the right wing party. Maybe they're just voting for protectionism, which I mean is understood as a left wing place. And you didn't show us the vignettes, so maybe you can talk to us about what the vignettes look like.
Yeah.
And also about whether the vignettes included clientelism. I think not. I think
I didn't show the test, the results of that. Yeah.
but I think your conclusion that clientelism is linked to this to the right wing parties is that all comes from data. That all comes from the feeding of data. Yeah. Right? So that's not part of the experiment, right?
We did run an experiment with the client. I didn't show you yet the results.
Right. Because that part was a bit is more new and a bit more difficult for me to believe. So if you could talk more, because I just don't see why clientelism would benefit right-wing parties more than mainstream parties, which have such long ties to those communities.
Why don't we let Bumba answer your questions?
Right.
And then we go with it.
I have some complicated, but
Okay, so let's let Bumba.
Okay, these are very, very good questions. No, thank you. So there's a bunch of them, and just let me know if I've missed out. Trying to write, but they're talking at the same time. So business nationalism, I didn't really define it again, just to keep the presentation brief. It is protectionism, and you're absolutely correct. Both the left and the right adopt it. The distinction, though, at least in between the left and the right, and I'm not so sure Vinet's picked that up very clearly. Perhaps they did. We made that very clear in the vignettes. That's in addition to trade protection, it's about promoting domestic private industry, crony capitalism, if you like. Okay. So you have these big business houses. I know Mexico has that. That has much. Many Brazil definitely has it in there as well. That the right-wing populists will come into office and promote these domestic private industry. Okay. So that I don't think the left-wing folks typically talk about that. That's an anathema kind of. Oh, we're not going to talk about domestic private business protection. Yeah. So I think there's a difference there. And I think our experiment picked that out. What surprised us is the marginalized group. Presuming they understood it when we did some checks here, did pick up on that. Okay. So that was to answer your first question. I missed your second. I didn't miss it. I just didn't write it quickly. Do you remember it?
Well,
so the clientelism one, right? The survey experiment.
Yes.
Okay. So that's a good question. We struggle with. Okay. So there. We were asked that, okay, you have, so they saw two vignettes at the same time. Okay. What they saw, and it was a complicated vignette kind of setup. So the financial crisis is a description. So they saw that here's a financial crisis that's happening. Okay. And then, in your country, you have these clientelist networks, your vote buying, there's what clientelism typically entails. So we had a picture of, cash being given and, people going, well, these are standard pictures of used in these vote buying experiments, basically. And what we found in the survey experiments, when I talk about right-wing populists, I'll get to that, is that when these, when the respondents are seeing both of these at the same time, they were responding very enthusiastically in voting for right-wing populists. Okay. When they were seeing both of these. When they just saw clientelism, they didn't care. Or when they just saw the financial crises and the business nationalism that was happening, they didn't care. But when it was both of this, okay, that they were very enthusiastic with their response in supporting and voting for right-wing populists. So you could see that.
That could come from what Christina was saying. It could be anger. It could.
It could be. No. Yeah, no, we don't have such a sophisticated experiment where we are picking up emotion. No, so certainly. that's a different ballgame. And those are things we have these crude confounders that we try to control for it. But that's good. It's that in terms of the implication, this is the last thing that I'll say, which again, these are big questions. I think they're just trying out for more research. Is I think what we need to do, and I'm not doing this as Vinita's doing this, is the way these right-wing populists are using these existing clientelistic. I mean, all the developing countries had left-wing parties and left-wing populist parties in office for a long time, well before the Bolsonaros came in Brazil, well before the BJP came in India, in the Philippines, and so on and so forth. But they left behind this infrastructure, this clientelistic infrastructure. We don't really test that. What we are finding out by work doing on the field, and again, it's not me so much, I'm taking too much credit there, this is Benito's work really, is that these right-wing populist parties have used that very successfully. Which is interesting because we know, at least especially, the study of Latin American clientelism is very rich. The work is just incredibly rich. And we know that left-wing parties have used it. It's something like that.
Of course. I mean, your answer about left-wing parties and right-wing parties talking about protectionism differently, that's a great answer, actually, because they really do talk about it. Just quickly, because I'm sure people will know. What about illegal immigration? I mean, I was surprised that Mexico was very high inclusion and very low, for example, in openness. I mean, that's exactly the problem that America thinks that too many immigrants are coming to Mexico and bringing them to America. And that might be because you're not, in your openness measure, it's all about.
It's all right. It's all about official policy. So by definition, I want to make clear, it's a measure of de jure policy and not a measure of actual flows. What we did in a previous paper as a validation check was to show that de jure openness policy is strongly correlated with actual flows, whereas inclusion is not and shouldn't be. But yeah, this is not at all, and it does get to a point that I didn't make here, but I probably will in the next draft of this paper. The literature on welfare chauvinism, for example, has typically run regressions that have some measure of the social safety net regressed on the share of the population that was born abroad, which could be correlated with immigration openness policy. But if there is a lot of illegal immigration, then it's picking up on other things. So, but we are in this paper trying to measure official policy, and we sort of have to bracket the illegal. Well, that's.
It comes from the laws, it doesn't come from numbers.
Exactly.
Andreas?
Great, thank you very much, both of you, for the presentation. And of course, also, I will try a little bit maybe to connect both the papers with my questions and comments. And I'm going to start with Bumba's one. So if I understand correctly, that right-wing populism in established or developed countries takes more the form of protecting, let's say, the working class from immigration, which is kind of David's topic.
Yeah.
It's also a form of globalization, but in developing countries, it's more protecting, let's say, the people from these financial exposures, a different form of globalization. Is that a correct description, kind of?
Yeah, it is. It is with the added thing is this, the financial crisis is just like it's like a trigger. It's just a trigger. I mean, when that happens, that's when all of this ball gets rolling. In the absence of financial crisis, we don't think all of this matters as much in the developing world. This financial crisis hits them really hard. And unlike the developed world where there's compensation schemes, welfare schemes, the case of the US, you can print the US dollar, you can use capital markets, the developing world simply cannot do that, And so financial crisis has these really devastating costs. Okay? So that's just a triggering mechanism, but it's important. Okay. But the difference is the trade protection, I think that's why this question is a really good one, is in the developing world, it comes with protection, and stop foreign competition, imports, all that stuff. More specifically, Chinese imports, actually. So I didn't have that during the presentation. But also where we will promote our domestic industry. And that's a very powerful kind of innovativity, which is not surprising. I mean, if in Latin America, again, going back to that, dependency theory, if you will, dependency, it'll just create domestic industry. It's a very powerful. But it's the right wingers who exploit that very nicely in the developing world, not so much in that thing. Because the business industry, the businesses are private, they're not public sector, they're not state. So the left, don't want to associate themselves. Sorry, long answer.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then kind of in the clientelistic work that right-wing parties do they differ from left-wing parties in your view? So do you have a different approach?
No, they don't. I mean, and that to us is surprising, but that's something we really haven't dug into in this project, and the results that I showed you are pretty preliminary. But it's interesting in the sense from our perspective, at least, is there nothing, the left wingers have always been doing it. It's interesting that the right wing, who by the way is to criticize the left for doing all that, right? You guys are using clientelism, vote buying, as a corrupt, don't get work done, things like that, standard kind of right wing complaints. They're doing the same thing. So they're being very savvy about it. That we find interesting. But we require much more better evidence, which you don't have at this micro level.
Related, kind of probably way outside of your paper, but given that there's, I believe that there is this kind of trilemma, and you need to make some sort of trade-offs given preferences of the public. And do you see a connection there with the different forms of populism that is emerging or has been going on in these countries? Or is there at least one response where there's less of right-wing populism, like a policy mixture that may not be that popular, but at least prevents from right-wing populists from rising? And it may or may not be sustainable. So that would be the first question. And the second one, more technical question, I guess, is about the lag structure. And so I guess if I'm a government and I'm vaguely aware that if I open my borders, my public, my citizens may somewhat react to that in some way or the other, and may kind of create policy bundles at the same time to maybe push in a little bit the blow, right? And so, kind of, is it, of course, if you take not one year lag, but you analyze it at the same time, there's some simultaneity issues. But I guess my question is just that we explore a little bit kind of election cycles, different lag structures, and to see the robustness of the results.
Yeah, lots of questions there. If I understood the first one right, and if this is not what you asked, please tell me. Let's suppose we got the trilemma structure right, and maybe we didn't, but let's suppose we did. A follow-up paper would then sort of be devoted to placing, like, why do some countries end up here versus there? And we haven't done a lot of thinking yet about the variables that might, but it seemed to me your question might be, is given a trilemma, would we expect to see right-wing governments show up somewhere different than left-wing governments? And the answer is possible. But I haven't thought this through. And I haven't thought this through in the following sense, because initially, so let's take something like cash compensation, which at least in the United States, we often refer to this as something like the third rail, which is that, for example, right-wing governments may often talk about cutting Social Security. And the Trump administration has hinted at this. But my intuition is that they won't do a lot because they are aware that this could, so I guess my prediction might be that I'm not sure we're going to see left and right-wing governments systematically showing up in the trilemma structure in different places. Maybe. I think a lot more, and my initial thought was that the three sides in that triangle might correspond with Esping Anderson's three varieties of welfare state capitalism, where inclusion and openness, but no compensation, was clearly the neoliberal line. And that the social democracy model was inclusion and compensation. But these, especially Scandinavian countries, were so far away from the sending countries that they didn't really have to worry a lot about openness. And the countries at the bottom were the corporatist Christian democracy. The terms get used differently, but they have openness, they have compensation, but they are very restrictive about who gets the compensation. So I guess I might expect a little, maybe one of the driving factors is the sort of the tradition of the welfare state more than its left-right stuff. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's some preliminary thoughts. We have played around with the lag structure. And if I remember correctly, it never got written up, was that we can produce these similar results with longer lags. I think it was up to 4 years. But my sense was there's already a lot of models in this paper. And I wasn't certain that I was going to, my biggest fear in the world I work in is causal identification. And so the lag structure was not going to help me there. And so, but you have a fair point, and that, it might be worth looking back at that.
Thanks, Andreas. Emiliano, después Lorena.
So thank you both of you for your presentations. I have a question for Professor Lindo. I'd like to know if you considered any alternative explanations that may not be directly related to the economic conditions that could explain this rise of the populist right.
So we do the standard kind of social science thing where we control for a lot of parasitism and whatnot. So the alternative explanations, at least, this is challenging, and we know relatively less about right-wing populism in the developing world. Again, in the US and Western Europe, a lot has been written about populism, right-wing populism, response to trade shocks, immigration, rise of xenophobia, whatever. Very little in the development. The main alternative, just to answer your questions, the main alternative explanation that we really did was particularly the rise of religious right parties, actually. People don't pay as much attention to that, okay? But that's an issue in the development. And why does that matter is because those parties talk about these cultural issues, okay, with the right-wing populists also talk. They use that kind of language, if you will, but we account for that, right? So that is one big alternative explanation that we accounted for. Another alternative which we accounted for is the fact that a lot of these countries just as they're exposed to financial crises. And this is a big debate among economists, development economists. I have some sense about it. It's a debate as to whether trade globalization has been that beneficial to the developing world. Okay, many would argue it has. There are others who would say, no, fairly, it's a mixed bag. But that in turn has led to enough frustration, anger, and things that has led to support for right-wing populists. So people make that argument in developing countries. So we've accounted for that. And those explanations don't typically happen. We have accounted for it.
Brandon?
Okay, so thank you for the presentation, it's very interesting. My question is for David. I'm going to try my best with this question. It's more oriented towards this idea of welfare chauvinism and recent literature that poses that maybe the rich, which are used to, I'm thinking more of the United States, which are the ones that oppose the most the idea of more taxes, direct taxes, in moments of crisis, and crisis that would be correlated a little bit with more migration in some states. If maybe it's considered that those that pay more taxes or argue for more compensation programs are not so rational towards who those taxes are directed to, because they're trying to alleviate other problems that are not directly related to or yes, towards.
So that's evidence again.
It would be evidence for less welfare chauvinism. But there's still like, and I feel like there's still a possibility, like it's more arguing towards the trying about the micro.
Yeah. So I am going to write a different version of this paper after this presentation. This is what I actually debated this morning, whether I would very quickly put together a new PowerPoint. Try it out here. And I decided no. But your question does bring me back to that. And so if what you are doing is, or asking is sort of some doubts about the logic of welfare chauvinism, I think our results might be consistent with this, in the sense that the debate as I see it, and this is what I'll probably do, is try to put, I could imagine John Gerard Ruggie, I think recently died, so he wouldn't come and ask me this, but I could imagine him saying that I don't care much about immigrant inclusion. That's not an external policy. So the relationship that I'm interested in is there a positive or negative relationship between immigration openness and the size of the social safety? And as I already said in response to your question, I think the papers that have done this, they weren't actually measuring immigration openness policy. They're measuring something that is downstream from that could be capturing a lot of illegal immigration, but that's not policy. So if you run a regression of saying, okay, I'm going to make, let's say, immigration openness as my dependent variable, and I'm going to regress this on the size of the social safety. For John Gerard Ruggie, it ought to be positive. For welfare chauvinism, it ought to be negative. But what we show you is it can be both. That is, it is strongly positive when, for low levels of immigration inclusion, that is, if citizens aren't worried that foreigners could get this, they're not going to oppose the expansion of the social safety. But they start to, so in this sense, I don't see our results as strongly, I mean, they incorporate the logic of welfare chauvinism, but I don't think they are unambiguously in support of that.
No, you're, thank you.
Thanks very much, David. Cristina?
I think there's one other thing that just, it's needling at me a little bit.
Please.
OECD countries are not all necessarily countries of destination. A lot of them are transition countries. And so with that in mind, the perspective towards integration might be different both from the administration and governmental and public. So a country like Mexico, for example, the immigration policy might be very open in some aspects, but it's also, it's temporary. They're going to stay here. We're in a period right now where that may be changing. The government of Mexico is becoming also a destination country. But it might be something that to try to take into account. Maybe not necessarily so much in the model, but through like the case. Onwards.
Yeah, no, right. You've got a fair point. And in our defense, what I think I would say here is that this was the reason I controlled among the substantive controls for net migration. Is I'm trying to at least absorb the fact that some of these countries, and here let's talk about the new entrants into the EU, these are our net sending countries in practice. But they are nonetheless, so the word I should have had is, what I'm looking at is the set of democratic potential destination countries. And some of these countries may not be net destination countries. You've got a lot of movement out of Central Eastern Europe into Western Europe. And your point is fair, is they may think about migration policy very differently. Because in some ways you don't need to worry about your openness policy if, for example, you are Somalia. There's very little immigration pressure on you. And so, but these are countries that do have policies because they are, and especially with pressures from the direction of Syria, with the Syrian civil war, these are countries that did have to think about it. Even if you don't have a lot of pressure in the same way Germany and UK, we've got to start to formulate some kind of coherent policy.
Mark, después.
Yeah, thank you both very much for very thoughtful working papers. Really interesting, very rich discussion too. And I guess I had some questions that I wasn't going to ask them because mostly they've been covered. But one was similar to Christina's, which is about the very different labor markets among the OECD countries. Mexico with a relative abundance of low-skilled labor, and let's say Denmark with a relative shortage of unskilled labor or low-skilled labor. So I was just wondering if you'd consider or thought about tried just taking not the OECD, but isolating the higher income countries and doing the test just on those to see what kind of answers you might have on that. And then the more specific thing, David, was how you operationalize compensation beyond cash transfers in terms of these compensations for all citizens or for eligible workers with workers' rights, that kind of thing. Were they really? Did you feel that they were really comparable across countries?
Well, your question is a good one, which is our compensation measure is simply total cash compensation divided by the population. So it does not account for who's eligible for it. So that's not reflected.
And then, again, thank you. Just, I mean, this is a really crude, not sharp like Christina's. I know you're not a country specialist on Mexico, but what's your sense of why not Mexico? Not enough financial crisis here, or?
Actually, to be fair to Mexico did a really good job after the '95 crisis. It is true, they haven't since then of building enough of a cushion. So has lesser problems actually with financial crisis after what happened in '95. So that's one reason why not Mexico. It's not the best case for us to do in terms of doing a more micro level work. Another, again, about my Mexican colleagues here. You know, well, I know even less about Mexico. I have keen interest in Mexico's economy. Relatively less about politics, beyond the headline news. As far as I know, right-wing populists haven't been around. Is that the case? I don't. Yes, no.
I think a Trump is coming here. I'm
Trump is
sure-
coming here.
I'm sure a Trump is coming here.
Yeah.
No, it's
No,
been controlled by the Free Party for so long.
Yeah.
A big administrative clientelistic network machine. And so-
I have a Chilean colleague who's moved to Maryland now, who's writing about right-wing populism in Latin America. In general, you know, we know that's happening in other parts of Latin America, like Chile.
Yeah.
Guy came pretty close, eventually lost. I don't think Bolsonaro is going anywhere. He's going to come back in some form or other. So yeah, I think right-wing populism might be an issue in Latin America as well. I certainly agree. Maybe Mexico as well. But any to answer your question.
Yeah, I just had a question about the axis of inclusivity, right? Is there a way for ethnic or racial biases that maybe make it more important to determine on which type of migrant is going to come? I'm thinking about, for example, Ukrainians going to Poland as opposed to Turkish refugees going to Sweden, for example. That might have an unexpected weight into the model that you consider.
I have to think about this a little bit. I mean, surely, for sure, our measures wouldn't reflect those kinds of things. This is, and for the most part, when we look at the OECD countries, as they report these changes to migration, these are typically written in fairly broad-based ways. So they're not specifically about immigrants from Poland or immigrants from Mexico or so for the most part, policy, even if there is sort of a potential migrant community in mind, policy isn't written with those terms in it. So, and in truth, this gets to another problem that you haven't mentioned yet, but somebody probably should. Since I ended with an argument about policy perhaps being split between what might be called high and low skill labor. And I'm going to use different terms in the next draft of the paper. We'll call it manual labor knowledge. Reflect different demands. But it turns out it's quite challenging to code the policy changes or all of the policy changes, or even most, about whether they apply to those two different types of migrants, because the rules are not typically written saying this is about manual labor. Sometimes it is, but if we had to sort every one of these policy changes that we see into, let's say, a high skill set and a low skill set, we couldn't sort most of them. Or it has different parts that apply to both.
Any other questions? Okay, I'll ask the last set of questions if you guys don't mind. I have a question for Goomba. I mean, it's a great project, but I think my question is related to one of Phil's question, and it's about clientelism, right? I mean, we know, at least in the case of Latin America, I mean, you presented the case of Bolsonaro. I don't know if we can claim that Nayib Bukele is another example of right-wing populism in Latin America these days. But we know that, you know, to use clientelistic networks, parties need resources, right? I mean, we know that there are different varieties of clientelism, of course, right? I mean, it could be vote buying, it could be, you know, these clientelistic networks, PRI style, basically PRI style. But if we think about the cases of Bolsonaro, if we think about the case of Nayib Bukele, I don't know if, the Argentinian case is, or could be another example of, populist right-wing party that came to power is, how do they get access to the clientelistic networks, right? Because when we make this transition, right? I mean, the idea of clientelism is you build this network so people can vote for you in the election. And when we think about Latin America, all these right-wing authoritarian populist parties are outsiders from the system, right? Yeah. Most of them newly created, right? I mean, Bolsonaro has been around for a while, but he never actually he never actually had any success or prominent success in a Brazilian election. So my question is, how do they appeal to people? Or how can they use this idea of clientelism to make people vote for them, right? If they do not have, if they don't have the resources. And I think it's crucial to understand your argument, right? I think when you talk about clientelism, and the other question is it really clientelism or is it just a failure of the party system, right? That they use to appeal to voters, because we know also that in Latin America there is a representation crisis, right? And then party systems, a lot of party systems are actually collapsing, right? And just the election of this, it could be right-wing populist authoritarian parties or left-wing, right? It's basically them that could generate the start of the collapse in the party system, right? So is there something related to the instability of the party system instead of clientelism? I mean, we can tie these two ideas, right? I mean, not necessarily, because the case of Mexico is a case of a very institutionalized party system, which also had a very clientelistic or has a clear clientelistic network. So those are my questions for Bumba. Then I have a question for David. I mean, I understand this is a different paper, David, but I think it's interesting in light of recent events in the world, right? I mean, we know migration or immigration these days is not only a problem of OECD countries, right? And I'm thinking here about the case of Mexico. Mexico has become a transit and a host country at the same time, right? And I wonder if this idea, but at the same time, right? I mean, to create compensation or to make people more prone to inclusion, you need a more developed economy, right? You need a state that is strong enough to support compensation for immigrants, and you need strong state, right, for people to actually, be able to go to school and accept new ideas that immigrants bring. Can we say that your argument, just as a thought, will travel, to these countries that are now, I mean, again, we can think about Latin America, which is, these days, when we think about this migration to the United States from Central America, which is a big issue in these countries. Can you say that your argument will travel or will apply to these developing economies? Thank you. Thank you again for very thoughtful, incredible talks.
So they're very good questions. I've trained them well.
Indeed.
So when he does well, I feel very proud. You all feel proud. Always. No, that's true. That's true. So let me answer your question. We don't have good evidence about right-wing populist parties exploiting clientelistic networks and how they do it, right? What little evidence we have, and this is really coming from actually even Bolsonaro and some BJP in India basically, is, so you asked very, very specific questions. It really got to the point. So resources they're able to raise because they're the party of big business. So, business nationalism, these domestic private capitalists, they love it. They give them the money. Campaign funds, campaign finance, right? Like all these tech guys are getting, the Elon Musk is getting Trump funds, right? So they have the resources. What we have found so far, but again, it's very preliminary. We don't have the level of evidence. Is that they're able to do two things, right-wing populist parties. They're able to engage or make promises of patronage, which happens in clientelism. They're able to do it. Okay, so they're able to use that clientelism environment to make those promises of patronage. Okay, and what is that we see very clearly, they do that all the time. What is very difficult to pin down, and again, this is very anecdotal, literally at this stage of interviews. You did your dissertation on what that, right? Remember correctly. That is something you have to tease out through, very tricky field experiments. And we have some very anecdotal evidence that they're doing that just as these other left parties have always been doing. But, and then the other question about parties, yeah, it could be. And, at least the only thing we can do there is control for that again in our large end models, which we do. And the results still hold in it, doesn't it? But it could very well be. Yeah,
So I think your question was, how well does this logic apply to developing countries, perhaps like Mexico? Now, Mexico was in that data set. So I'm gonna kind of answer. I think it does with some things that ought to be added. Okay, so what I mean by this is they got to be democracies in the sense that the whole argument is about things that we think policymakers would like to do. Privately, they might say, listen, we'd like to have a social safety net. Privately, we'd like to have a more liberal migration policy. And my experience in DC was people are happy to tell you this. They just didn't know how to get there. Okay, so your point though about these developing democracies and the size of their social safety net is exactly right. I mean, that's why you asked it, which is that they can't yet provide as much. And you could see that when I plotted countries into the triangle, is that the countries that showed up and were below average in terms of compensation were Mexico, were the Central Eastern European countries. Okay, but I still think it potentially applies to them and certainly in their future. And what I mean by that is that they're going to get demands for social safety net as they develop economically.
And because of the flows of immigration, right? They're currently actually going through or staying there.
Right. And so, and one of the other scholars, sociologists who study migration, the biggest predictor of actual flows, not of policy, but of actual flows, is basically differentials in GDP per capita. And so, as Mexico gets wealthier, it's going to get pressure for both the bigger social safety, but it's also going to have more demand from Central America. And so, in this sense, these policies, how does the democratic policymaker reconcile these things? And I guess our argument, if it's right, is with difficulty.
Christine?
I'm gonna finger on the elite party, well, it's all crazy. The right-wing party's ability to capture votes and then once they get this in terms of using those clientele networks. With a proposal on a potential mechanism, actually two. And one is at least here in Mexico, what we see happen is that not the party heads themselves, like the most visible figure, not your president or your party president, but a lot of the other people will change their politics 180 degrees if they notice that the tide is shifting. And so we see a lot of people happening. Morena, for example, previously, we're in pretty, you could argue these centrist tries to lean left, but it's a stretch of an argument. But a lot of them have gone completely in. We've also seen people from PAN join Morena, which is the left party, right? And it seems to be that they can bring their networks with them in that process. And then the other end of things there is tactic copying. The other thing that we're seeing Morena do is copy the tactics of previous for a long time. So I'm curious if those might be mechanisms that are at play in other developing economies.
These are both very good points. The tactic copying I can see. very easy. But this is an original thought that these individual politicians bring in the clientelist network when they switch parties. And again, in the developing world, again, I'm generalizing here, but without any clear evidence, that happens. So that's a great point. I just wrote it down, put a circle over it because I'm really going to look for that. I do believe it. I do believe it. Yeah, more than that. No, I believe that. I think we haven't looked at that's an original thought.
Marian?
I'm very sorry, I was lost, so I was here late, but I just really want to push this, the predictor that you just mentioned, the GDP. So I was just thinking about the United States. So if you were to break that down nationally, you would see that not necessarily people are arriving at the richest states in the US. So I studied, this is my bias, so I studied public opinion and local level relations. So on the one hand, I would say not necessarily the people arrive in the wealthiest states within the United States. So that would sort of question the argument, right, of the GDP. I think the GDP is, is also compounding other variables. So this is something I initially thought that I would, study in my PhD why people migrate, and it just became so difficult at work that I moved away from that and I just studied integration. Because it's very hard to understand the motivation of individual immigrants and why they go and whether it's economic or whatever. But I think the relationship that you just mentioned, I was just thinking about it in my research, really goes for cities. So cities that have a higher GDP do attract more immigrants, and I think from the work that I've done in the cities, it is really the job opportunities for sure, but it's also the flexibility of the market and how they can, sort of hide, because they don't necessarily arrive at, the wealthiest suburbs in the United States, right? They don't go to Connecticut, but somehow arriving to London or Paris or New York, and even in the cases that I've seen in England, London really allows people to integrate much faster and better because of the structure of the economy. So that was just food for thought in terms of how to break down that GDP predictor and understand the motivation of it. Individual migrants.
Yeah, for the most part, my thoughts about including this as a control variable was to capture very much the variation that you were talking about, which is that I've got to account for the fact that some set of countries in the OECD are simply going to have less compensation because they are not as rich as Norway and Switzerland. And for other countries like the United States, it's a very deliberate choice. This is sort of our neoliberal ideology, and this gets back to the question about left and right governments. It's my time in Europe. Sorry, as an American, I have typically thought we have a left wing and we have a right wing party, one's Democrat, one's Republican. But of course, you go to Europe, and every European will remind right, is you have a center right and a right. and yes, and so I do think it will be tricky if this trilemma approximation is correct to find good predictors of where different countries show up at different points in time. Because all I did with that slide was said, here's where they are, here's where they look in 2015. But if you ran that back in time, these countries do move around in these spaces, not immediately, but at one point in time, the UK would not have been in the middle of that triangle, which was my placement for indicating it was below average on all three. It's, I think, fairly consistently been below average in compensation, but not as much as you pointed out on migration policy.
Any other questions? Rodrigo, two
Thank
more
you.
questions and then we have to unfortunately.
Very lively discussion.
Thank you both for your presentation. I have a question for David. I was wondering if there is an effect of the type of government in each country. Right? Specifically, if you have divided or unified government, because it seems that some policies fall in the executive sphere, but some of them, especially the compensation policies, have to pass through Congress, right? So if you have a divided government, maybe it's harder to solve the dilemma, right, than if you have a unified government. I was wondering if you could talk for that or.
I don't in these models, but it's a good point because in fact, I do have that data. I mean, I think I can easily retrieve some measure of, I'm at a loss to remember what this variable is, but there are operational indicators for, and so.
Minority or majority government. in
Yeah.
case of the-
Right, and so I think we can, we just didn't, but we will.
Carlos?
My question is for Professor Bomba. I was thinking about, well, I know that it's for developing countries, but for developed countries, I was thinking about the recent French elections. For example, when the European parliamentary elections in France happened, finally the National Rally, after a long time, gained a lot of seats, and far right wing party gained a lot of seats. So everybody thought that maybe it was the time for the National Rally to finally take over the majority of the local parliament or the French parliament. That happened June 9th, I think, of the early June. And by the end of June, Macron shut down the parliament and called for new elections. And surprisingly for everyone, the National Rally did not win the majority. It was actually like a new coalition, the left-wing coalition. So I was thinking about when we say that it happened like such a drastic shift in elections from the European parliamentary elections and the local elections, because I thought that maybe, well, if I'm not wrong, Macron's administration did not really did well in economic terms, and maybe that could have explained why the National Party had more votes. But it seems like the National Party gained votes, and there was a sudden disapproval of the National Rally, and then the left-wing party, not necessarily Macron's party, but the left-wing party came back to the election. So why would you say that this radical shift between two elections that a month away, less than a month away, happened?
In the French, I don't know this specific election. I did read about it. I think people are really unpacking. They're intrigued by what happened. Again, this is what we are doing. It's quite distinct. I just believe what happened in France. This is my own belief. There's no evidence as yet for these things. Is people in France did get freaked out enough with the national, with Le Pen, and like, oh my God, that kind of stuff. And they just kind of woke up, like, let's go. And so all the left-wing mobilization worked pretty well, in the end. We know that. But we found that out much later, That's just observation, that's all I know, and what I've read in newspapers and all that. And I suspect, again, just moving away from France, in the US, it's the Democrats trying to do that, basically. This is threat to democracy. That was the message. That was the campaign message till the very end. But it didn't work. In France, it worked. In the US, it worked.
Any other questions from the audience? Well, thank you so much. Very productive, very lively conversation.
Thank you
so much.
Really appreciate
Thank you, Bomba. Thank you, David. And we hope to see you again soon in another event of our division. Thank you. Thank you. You're sitting in the middle.
Yeah, I'm sitting in the middle with the phone.
I figured if I had this